So I don't know what this sermon's going to be like this morning. I don't know if it's going to be successful or unsuccessful, because I'm a very transparent person. It's hard for me not to be. So I've been discombobulated all week. Have you ever been discombobulated? So we were on vacation, with a big extended family vacation up in Michigan, with our kids and grandkids and nieces and nephews and their kids and sisters and brothers, and right from the beginning of the week I was off. Not like really sick, but off enough that my wife went and got a COVID test, and I was negative, but my brain's been weird in my head all week, so I don't know what this sermon will be like. So, but you've loved me for a long time, and you'll love me whatever happens this morning. So, I've been thinking a lot because I decided to do this little series, about the unentangled Jesus, about the ways we get tangled up and tangle things up that Jesus is not. And so I've been thinking a lot about hope lately, and I don't mean to sound morbid, but I think I've been thinking about hope more because I'm not as young as I used to be. And because, was that vague enough for you, sweetheart? She hates any references to my age because those are references to her age. So so we could all say that, right? We're not as young as we used to be, right? Even if you're 15, you're not as young as you used to be. But I'm not as young as I used to be, and it has recently occurred to me that our relationship with hope just keeps shifting through the different seasons and stages of our lives. And the truth is that a lot of people lose hope as life goes on, because so many of the hopes that we hang our hat on earlier in life, we eventually lose. We lose youth. We lose the people that we love. As I was writing this paragraph of my notes, I kept thinking of that scene in City Slickers where Billy Crystal's giving the depressing talk to his kids' class, and he's saying, value this time in your lives, kids, and he starts talking about all the terrible things that will happen. But yet there's some reality to that. We experience rejection by people we love or that we were loved by at one time. Our health often fades. Certain experiences that we always told ourselves, someday I'll finally have that experience. Sometimes we never do have those experiences. Maybe for a long time we told ourselves, someday everything in life will be, the way that I've wanted it to be, finally how it needs to be, and then I'll have peace, then I'll have some rest. But then sometimes that never really quite comes together in the way we had envisioned it in our minds and our hearts. And honestly, for many people, just economically and circumstantially, all of adult life is simply decades of struggle. I mean, we really all work really hard, by what we do with our jobs, the way we manage our money and our relationships. We work really hard to insulate ourselves from that. But the truth is, if we look around, if it isn't us, it's many people who just have an adult lifetime of struggle. And, it makes me think of a kind of a hard saying from Henry David Thoreau, who said that the mass of men live lives of quiet desperation. There's a lot more of that than we want to admit. Sometimes for ourselves, but so often for other people. And when we are afraid that what we need is not coming to us, what it often develops in us is this mindset of scarcity that kicks in. And it causes us to react to life in all kinds of ways, all of them fearful. And this is one of the things I find striking when Jesus stands before Pontius Pilate in the 18th chapter of John's Gospel. If anybody ought to have been having a moment of scarcity, it would have been Jesus in John 18. Because in John 18, Jesus is coming to the end of his earthly life. And so whatever the earthly things were that he had been hoping to experience, and I don't know what that was like for Jesus, those have largely passed him by. Those are largely behind him now. He's on trial and the end of his life is near. But what we find in Jesus is the opposite of a mentality of scarcity. I'm just going to kind of read you the whole little passage because I think it puts it in context beautifully. John 18:28, then they led Jesus from Caiaphas to the praetorium, and it was early in the morning. But they themselves did not go into the praetorium lest they should be defiled. Jews can't go in those Gentile spaces. So that they could still eat the Passover. You don't want to get messed up with God right before the Passover. Pilate then went out to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" And they answered, and they said to him, "If he were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him up to you." Like, why do you need to know the specifics? He's a bad guy. That's why we brought him. And Pilate says, "Then you take him and judge him according to your law." And then they basically say to Pilate, "Listen, you of all people know as the Roman governor that we can't put anybody to death. You Romans won't let us. You won't let us carry out capital punishment, and that's what we want to do. We want to kill him." And then Pilate entered the praetorium again, and he called Jesus, and he said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus answered him, "Are you speaking this from yourself, or did other people talk to you about me?" And Pilate answered, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and your chief priests have delivered you to me. What is it you have done?" And Jesus answered and said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight, so that I would not be delivered to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from here." Pilate said to him, "Are you a king then?" And Jesus said, "You rightly say that I am a king. And for this cause I was born, that I would come into the world and I would bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is on the side of truth hears my voice." Of course, at that point, Pilate turns pretty cynical and he says, "What is truth? Like, come on, you know." But I don't know if you've ever looked at this story this way, but Pilate is sitting there telling Jesus, "Listen, I have the power to kill you." And Jesus in that moment is talking about the fact that he possesses a kingdom. "I have the power to take away almost everything you have is gone, Jesus. And what's left, your very breath, I have the power to take away." And Jesus says, "Well, actually, see, I have this whole kingdom. But it's not like the kingdoms you know. And so you're not going to understand it, and my disciples aren't going to fight for it with swords and clubs." Jesus is saying to Pilate, you think everything is precarious. You think the only powerful thing is this political power that you have at your disposal. But there is something else that you don't see. This is one of those themes in the New Testament, in the teaching of Jesus and picked up by the early Christians, that I actually think in my own life, and I've been on this journey with Christ for a long time, that I am just beginning to hear and explore after all these years of hearing these things and reflecting on these things in this journey with Christ. This theme that there is something we haven't known, something to be seen, something to become aware of, that is really the treasure that makes everything okay. That can give us the hope that everything will be okay, even when we have experienced losses. And all of us have experienced losses. It makes me think that somebody who probably knew the secret that I'm just beginning to really reflect on in my own soul was St. Julian of Norwich, if you've ever heard of her. You'll recognize this quote probably. She said, "All shall be well." Anybody know the rest of it? "And all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well." How did she know that? Jesus says, "Well, you know, I know you think everything's precarious and you've got all this power, but it's this whole other kingdom, and that's what I'm anchored to." I hear it in Jesus' teaching when he talks to us about the birds of the air and the Father's benevolence toward them, right? He says, look at the birds of the air. They're not gathering in barns. They're not, but there's this whole net of care that's surrounding them. And when he talks about the lilies of the field and how they have a glory that is not dependent on them or on anything they did to make themselves glorious. I think Jesus is actually talking about us. That we have a glory that is not dependent on us or anything that we do to make ourselves glorious, which is what we're usually trying to do, to somehow make ourselves more than we think we are, because we think we're nothing, when in fact we're so much. So Jesus is trying to tell us about the benevolent net of God's care that's always holding us and always hanging in the background of our lives to catch us, but which we seem unaware of. And he's pointing to this glory about each of us as human beings that's natural to us, that we don't have to generate, but which we seem blind to. He's basically saying you don't have to make yourself into something, you are something. And I wonder if we see these mentalities as they pervade us and others. Do we understand that when people are trying to make themselves something big, it's really that they're afraid that they're not? Right? But we have to get a hold of that, because the world runs on all this power of making ourselves big, of making ourselves glorious. That when people work all kinds of power over other people, they're totally operating actually from a mentality of scarcity. It looks powerful, right? The powerful people always look like they have so much, but they're always so terrified of losing everything. They're operating from a mentality that says there is nothing in the universe watching over you except your own desperate efforts. I think Jesus knows that trying to provide for our own ultimate sense of importance and well-being is it's like us, tying all these small knots. Like every day we're tying these knots and we're saying, I got to get this just right so that, I have what I need, and so that other people see me a certain way, and I got to get other people to go with my program because, things aren't working out the way they need to, so I got to get these knots just right. And then we get angry when people don't cooperate with the way we think things need to be, because we're saying all these knots have got to be just right. We're just making all these tangles. And then out of these mindsets where we're getting everything just, we're controlling everything and get everything just the way we want, projecting ourselves to be a certain way. What we really end up doing, because we're drawing other people into the way we think it should be, is then what we're doing is we're taking this and then we're binding other people with all these things that we say, well, this is how it's got to be, right? And then that's when we have this little thing that we call relationship problems. Because we've got it all it's got to be this way and it's got to be that way, and then we put that on the people in our lives, and the relationships get twisted up in all these knots. And Jesus is saying that if we could see it, we don't need to do this, because there is a care, a benevolence surrounding us that tells us what we are, that tells us how precious we are, and that this benevolence and glory are the very fabric of things because they emanate from God. They're actually the real fabric of things. We're creating all the illusory stuff. And I don't think we've pondered Jesus' words about the birds and the lilies very deeply, because the world often feels just the opposite. The world often feels scarce and precarious to us. So we don't know what to do with what Jesus is telling us, right? The world feels scarce, it feels precarious, we're tying our knots, we're worried about how everything is going to work out and whether things are going to work out, if any of the things we hope for are going to happen, is anything going to work out the way that we need it to work out? And then Jesus comes along and starts talking about the birds. Says, man, just kind of chill out like the birds, and just look at the glory of the lilies. You got all that going for you, and we're feeling like we got nothing going for us, right? The Apostle Paul came from a scarcity mentality before he met Jesus, and I never really thought about it this way, but he was part of a group of religious leaders who needed to control exactly what people believed and how in their religion, how they behaved, because he served a demanding and stingy God who would only bless people if they had the perfect beliefs and they kept all the rules perfectly. And Paul was angry, Paul, who we knew as Saul of Tarsus early on in the book of Acts, right? Paul was angry about the Jesus movement because it colored way outside the lines, and it suggested that God had somehow embraced weakness by allowing his chosen one to be crucified. If you are a really religious person, well, I would suggest to you this way, that if Jesus came again today and did what he did back then, if he went to the cross, I think most Christians would reject him out of hand, because that's not really the God that Christians want. Christians want a God who will exercise power over people and force everybody to be exactly the way he says they're supposed to be. That's still the mentality about God. And so try to, get your mind there with the Apostle Paul, who's like, God is never going to fix things for the Jews unless everybody starts towing the line perfectly. So we got to get all these people to believe the right things, and they got to obey all those Old Testament laws exactly the right way. And so then the Christians say, well, actually, God came down here, and in this great act of love, he allowed himself to be arrested and mocked. And you're like, so that, in their mind, that just, Paul's like, you're just making God weak. God's not like that. He's not weak. He's powerful, and he compels people. In fact, Paul knew this verse from the Old Testament book of Deuteronomy that said, "Cursed is everyone who is hanged on a tree." And for Paul, that would have been like, what do they call it in court? What do they call it when they enter a piece of evidence? This would have been the number one piece of evidence, is that Christ died hanged on a tree, and the Bible itself says anyone that happens to is under the curse of God. So this isn't God loving human beings. This is Christ under the curse of God. He is obviously not the chosen one. He's not the Christ. He's not the anointed. And so, because the cross was weakness. And then in Paul's mind, God was not a weak God who gives things up. He was a powerful God who demands and requires and demands and requires and demands and requires. And then by the time of his first letter to the Jesus followers in Corinth, he's writing that the cross, contrary to what it looks like at face value, contrary to what he once thought, that the cross is not foolish, but it's the wisdom of God, and that the cross is not weak. It's actually the most powerful thing ever. And of course, Paul comes to see all these things exactly the opposite, 180 degrees from where he started out. Now, I would love to talk with Paul someday, I don't get to yet, about this shift. Like, if you can imagine this guy, he's going around and he's killing Christians because he's saying, you are misrepresenting God. You're saying God, you're identifying God with this weak act on this cross, that the Romans executed this guy. And Paul's like, that absolutely can't be the case. And how he made that shift, I don't entirely know. But by the time of that first letter to the Corinthian church, he's talking about how the cross is not the foolishness of God. It's not foolish. It's the wisdom of God. It's the wisdom of God. And it's not weak. It's the power of God. He's basically saying it's the most powerful thing in the universe. So I don't know how he got there, but as I've pondered it, it seems to me that there's no way Paul could come to see things in this different way without coming to the conclusion that God is so expansive, right? Paul's God was narrow and constricting and demanding. He must have come to see that God was so expansive, so rich in goodness, and that love is so much greater than that anything that competes with it, that it simply can't be diminished by anything. That it can't be diminished by anything, not even by death. Paul goes so far as to say that if the rulers of this age had been able to see this expansive goodness and its invincibility, and how it cannot be conquered even by death, and how a love that's this magnificent will inevitably restore all things, well, I'll read it to you. He says, we speak the wisdom of God, 1 Corinthians 2, in a mystery. The hidden wisdom which God ordained before the ages for our glory. Now listen to this. Which none of the rulers of this age knew. For if they had understood it, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. Paul's like, if they could have seen that there's this expansive goodness and love in the universe that's going to restore everything, they would have realized that the very act of pounding nails into the hands and feet of Christ was counter to all of that enterprise. It was counter to it. And now you hear, if you listen to the next verse, Here's where, and this is what makes me suspect this about Paul, that he's moved from this scarce view of God, right? God's got just enough that he's got to demand that everybody keep pouring it in his bucket. He's got to, demand and require, demand and require. And all of a sudden, he's got this expansive view of God as having so much that he can give it all away, and there's still just as much there as there was to begin with. Listen to what he says. If they had understood this, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. As it is written, eye has not seen, nor ear heard, nor has it entered into the heart of man the things which God has prepared for those who love him. He's got so much. He's got so much. God's pockets are never empty. There is no scarcity. That's the lie, is that there's scarcity. That's the lie, is that there isn't this benevolent love watching over us in the universe. But they did crucify Jesus, and what we learned is that this benevolent love of the universe we call God could not be diminished, and even more, that the attempt to diminish it, to kill it, only became an occasion for the love to shine brighter than ever before and to be victorious. It's like God comes into the world, and we human beings say, we're going to nail it down, we're going to kill this love once and for all. And the resurrection is like, hi there. It's me. It's love. I'm back. And have you ever noticed that when Jesus rises from the dead, there's not an iota of retribution? If you and I got murdered that way, unjustly, and tortured, we'd come back and we'd be like, yeah, there's going to be some hell to pay. Like maybe not forever, but that wasn't very nice. You know what Jesus' first words of the new world are? Peace be with you. Peace be with you. Because he has enough peace. Because he has enough love. Because his pockets are not empty. Because it can't ever be taken away from him. And what he's trying to tell us is, it can't ever be taken away from us. Not by the worst things that happen to us. I want to end this message. I've been a little discombobulated. Maybe this message is a little discombobulated, but I want to end it this morning by just pointing out two other things that Paul shines the light on in this 1 Corinthians passage that again point to the difference between a mentality of expansive benevolence and love versus one of scarcity. The first is something he says in chapter 3, verse 3. The people in the church there were squabbling a lot with each other in this church. And Paul says to them, he says, where there is envy, strife, and divisions among you, are you not fleshly and still behaving like mere men? Very interesting. The mentality of scarcity divides us. Because if you have more, I might have less. And then sometimes people actually use the mentality of scarcity to divide us. I mean, just look around the world politically right now. Do you hear the fear-mongering that's out there? Where people are saying, all these bad people are coming after you. And then everybody goes, oh my God, you know? Paul would have said, what are they going to do? Are they going to kill me? Okay. Because you can't take away what I have, right? That was Jesus standing before Pilate, right? Like, hey, I can kill you. And Jesus is like, yeah, and I have a kingdom. Right? So there's all this, people are saying like there's all these people coming after you, or they're saying, all these bad things are happening and everything around you is terrible and you should be afraid, and out of that fear you should hate those people. That's every day on the news right now in America. Or, Israelis can only have a good life at the expense of Palestinians. Jesus would say, why? Why does there have to be scarcity? Why does there have to be enmity? Why is it that this person can only experience the goodness at the expense of this person, right? All of those mentalities are around us all the time. So what I want to suggest to you this morning is that when you get sucked into the divisions that see some human beings as terrible and others as the good guys, you're being sucked into a mentality of scarcity. There's only so much to go around. And so you gotta decide who you're with and who you're against. And that's the way that it has to work. And the very essence of the gospel is, no, that is not the way it works. That is not the way it works. And then the second thing I just want to point out to you is that Paul calls this mentality of scarcity the spirit of the world. He says, now we have received, this is 1 Corinthians 2:12, we have received not the spirit of the world. And I know when Christians say the spirit of the world, they go, yeah, smoking and drinking. It's like we got all these ideas of what we think worldliness is. I'll tell you what worldliness is. It's a mentality of scarcity that makes you hate your brother. That's worldliness. He says, we have received not the spirit of the world, but the Spirit who is from God. You got to hear this. Oh my gosh. But the Spirit who is from God, that we might know the things that have been freely given to us by God. And right here is where Jesus would step back into frame and say, consider the birds of the air and the lilies of the field. Do you see all the gifts? Are you beginning to see that the lie is that there is no benevolent care surrounding you in this life? Because the truth is actually that there is. And as I said, I don't think we've heard Jesus very deeply about the expansive care of God and the glory he's bestowed on every human being. But I think we should try, because when we can get a sense of the abundance that we have in God, and no longer feel entangled in this fearful mentality of scarcity, I think we'll have more peace. I think our hope will be in something larger. Yeah, life is hard. Jesus said in this life you will have trials. We don't get everything we had hoped for. It doesn't all work out perfectly. But our hope will be in something larger, that we, in the love in which we are held and in the glory in which we are made, ultimately cannot be destroyed. And I think out of that, we'll find ourselves living in a much greater freedom to love other people.